In this module, we'll explore the many ways to remotely access another computer or server. These components include Windows VPNs, PowerShell, Remote Desktop, Remote Assistance, and the Remote Desktop Gateway. Let's begin with Remote Desktop. You use Remote Desktop to access one computer from another. For example, administrators use Remote Desktop to connect to network servers from their desks. If you're connecting from home, you usually also must connect through a virtual private network or a VPN. We'll examine VPNs later on. When you remote in, as the process is often referred to, you'll have access to all your programs, files, and network resources as if you were sitting in front of the computer you're remoting into. If you're connecting to a Windows 2008 server, you will have your own session on the server. If someone was physically sitting at the server and logged in at the same time, they would see their own desktop session, not yours. You cannot remote into another computer or server unless the administrator has already given you remote login privileges on that computer. Let's take a quick look at those steps. I'm using a Windows 2008 server tool called Server Manager. By the name, you've probably guessed that this is our central tool for managing a server. And I get to this dialog box. There are other ways to get here, but this will work for our purposes. When I check the box, I find out that what this is really doing is opening up a port on the firewall so we can remote in. Do you remember the port number for Remote Desktop? I also need to tell Windows what users are allowed to remote in. I would normally add a group, but for demo purposes, I'll just empower a user named Joe. Notice also there was another choice called Configure Server Manager Remote Management. That choice would have allowed me to open up the firewall for other remote management options such as PowerShell. Now let's see Joe connect to the server using Remote Desktop. He has connected before, so Windows already remembered what server he had connected to earlier. He just puts in his password. And we get an error message about the Remote Computer Server Certificate. Windows is telling me that the server is offering a certificate, but that it does not trust the certificate authority who issued it. If I look at the certificate for more information, I can see the problem. If I wanted to, I could tell Windows to always trust the issuer of the certificate. That's a security risk unless you're absolutely sure of the validity of the issuers, such as an in-house certificate authority. I'm now in a remote session with the server. I control that desktop. Notice I can make changes, and I can run software on the remote machine. You can do that with Remote Desktop, but by default, you cannot control the remote machine with Remote Assistance. We will look at Remote Assistance next so you can see the differences. Notice that I can still see my local desktop as well as the remote computer. No one needs to be sitting at the other computer for me to remote to it. This is what Remote Desktop looks like from the point of view of someone sitting at the server console while someone else is remoting in. They don't see anything that the remote user is doing. And I'm going to close my remote session without logging out. So when I reconnect, my stuff is waiting on my desktop just as I left it. It's important to distinguish Remote Desktop from Remote Assistance. Remote Assistance is a Windows feature that lets you help another user from your desktop. Usually the user must invite you to help them. You will both then see the same desktop at the same time. Here's an example of using Remote Assistance. I'm a user on a Windows 7 machine who needs some help from an IT staff person. I run the Remote Assistance tool. I'm offered several ways to invite someone to help me. The email choice is grayed out because there's no email program on this computer, so I will choose to save the invitation to a file. In a production environment, we would most likely just email the invite using the in-house email program. I'll send this file to the IT person using a web-based email program instead. I'll need to call or text this person to give them the password as it's not included in the invitation itself. Now here's the IT person's point of view. The IT person is currently sitting in a Windows 2008 server. Because this is a server and it's normally locked down, Remote Assistance had to be added as a feature ahead of time, and Remote Assistance had to be allowed through the firewall. The IT person has already received the invite, and they double-click on it to start the Remote Assistance program. And then they enter the password provided by the customer. And you'll notice that we see nothing, and there's a note that says waiting for acceptance at the bottom. This is what the customer sees at this point. Even though they sent an invite, they still have to approve the connection. And here's what the IT person sees. Remote assistance includes other options, such as a chat feature. Another remote connection option is through a VPN or virtual private network. This is commonly used when connecting to work from home or a hotel room using your laptop. A VPN uses what's referred to as a tunneling protocol to set up an encrypted channel between a client and a VPN server at work. Windows 2008 R2 includes the capability to create a VPN server. Here's what it looks like when someone at a hotel connects to their office over the internet using a VPN. Now the actual screens will vary depending on what client operating system you're using, such as Windows Vista or Windows 7 or higher. However, the end result is the same. If I've connected before, or if an administrator has set this up for me, I'd already have a VPN icon in my network connections. But for demo purposes, I'll start from scratch. I put in the name or IP address of the VPN server given to me by the administrator. Then I put in my credentials. And my VPN is set up. I like to rename my connections so I can tell them apart easily. Now I'm connected. I can now get to resources inside the company, such as this shared folder. The important thing to notice is that I'm using my desktop. There is no picture in a picture, as you would see with remote desktop or remote assistance. It's as if my work monitor and keyboard were on a really long cable that I dragged to my hotel room. If I go to command prompt and run the ipconfig command, I can see that my computer has two network IP addresses, one for my real connection and the other for my VPN tunnel. Now that I have a VPN, I could start a remote desktop session with another server if I wanted to. But what if I want to remote in using remote desktop from my hotel room through the internet without setting up a VPN? This could be done, but most companies will not allow this because the data would not be secured. Besides, their firewall will most likely be blocking port 3389, the port needed by remote desktop. We could use a service called the Remote Desktop Gateway to let this happen. The gateway service lets us connect using remote desktop, but with some major differences. Instead of using RDP port 3389, we will connect using port 443. Do you recognize that port? It's the port for SSL. So the gateway lets us RDP over SSL, so we get the encryption and security of SSL without a VPN. It's like a mini VPN for just one protocol. And port 443 is usually open on a company firewall, so we don't need to open any other ports. The gateway service is included for free with Server 2008. Connecting is not free. Every computer that connects to the gateway will need a CAL, or Client Access License, which is sold separately. Another way to manage a remote computer is through the use of PowerShell. PowerShell is a command line and scripting language. PowerShell uses command line commands. PowerShell has many commandlets and capabilities. Learning PowerShell is a course in itself. For our purposes, we're just going to take a peek at some PowerShell commands that let us access remote computers. We find PowerShell under the Accessories menu. PowerShell is the command line program. PowerShell ISE is the integrated scripting environment. ISE is a graphical tool for using PowerShell instead of command prompt based. PowerShell ISE is commonly used when you're creating PowerShell scripts. Let's look at the plain version of PowerShell. Some of the remote commands that I will be demonstrating require additional services and firewall exceptions. These steps have already been completed for our demo. Notice the PS at the beginning of the line. This reminds me that I'm in PowerShell and not an ordinary command prompt. PowerShell commandlets use a verb-noun construction. The get verb lets me see things, so if I want to see the services that are running on my computer, I type get service. That's a long list. I just want to know about the print spooler service. If I want to know about this process on a remote computer, I just add the computer name parameter to my command. Not all PowerShell commandlets work on remote computers. If I wanted to run a command that was not remotable, I could start a remote PowerShell session on that computer. I could then run my PowerShell commands as if I were sitting at that computer. First, let me clear the screen by using the clear host commandlet. I enter my PowerShell session by using the enter ps session command, followed by the names of the computer where I want to start a session. The command names are not case sensitive. I'm just typing them that way for clarity. I'm now at a PowerShell prompt on the other computer. I can now run any PowerShell command and get the same result as if I were actually sitting at the other computer. I'm going to start the spooler service that shows as stopped. For this, I'm using the start service commandlet. Notice there was nothing to see after starting the service, as this commandlet does not output any results to the screen by default. I'll use the get service commandlet one more time to confirm my results. And then I leave my remote session using the exit ps session commandlet. So PowerShell, Remote Desktop, Remote Assistance, VPNs, and the Remote Desktop Gateway offer us many methods to remotely access and administer other computers.